Hello, students. Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology, chapter on the spinal cord, the spinal nerves, and spinal reflexes. So this chapter, the reading, most of the reading can be found in chapter 13. And I have also added some supplemental reading materials on the blackboard that you have to master. So the important learning objectives in this chapter is for us to master the anatomy and physiology of the spinal cord. So the central nervous system is made of the brain and the spinal cord. So we'll focus on the spinal cord today and brain next week. We'll also study how the spinal cord, being so precious, is protected by connective tissue layers. They are called the spinal meninges. We'll study how it's protected. We'll study the histology of the spinal cord. So if you do a cross section of the spinal cord, you'll be able to see certain places it's white, certain places it's gray. It's called gray matter and white matter. And we'll study how they play a role in relaying sensory information to the brain and bringing back motor commands. We'll talk about spinal nerves, the distribution pattern in the spinal nerves and the regions that they innervate the body. So when a nerve is monitoring a tissue, the word that's used is called innervate, I-N-N, innervate. We'll talk about neural pools. So this is like a functional grouping of neurons. They're called neural pools. We'll study that. And we'll also talk about how they interact and how they can work together to send the message. And we'll also talk about a neural reflex. So the main function of the spinal cord, so you can see the brain and the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is the bridge between the extremities of the body and the central processing system of information, right? The brain is the boss. So the spinal cord is the bridge. It's the conduit. So there are two vital functions for the spinal cord for transmission of the nerve impulse. So it's going to take all the sensory information from all the receptors in the periphery of your body to the brain for processing, and it brings back efferent or motor commands to the effectors to the rest of the body. So that's the transmission of nerve impulses. The second vital function of the spinal cord is spinal reflexes. See, sometimes your body is in danger. There's not enough time for the message to go to the brain. So the spinal cord itself will make a quick decision to respond to the stimuli. So that is called spinal reflex. So the afferent or the message from the sensory receptors, either the brain or the spinal cord, they will enter for processing. And the processed information comes out as an efferent or motor output. So the motor output is either going to affect a skeletal muscle, a smooth muscle, or your cardiac muscle. Your brain might command your bicep to contract. It can also correspond with a gland, asking a gland to secrete a hormone maybe. Or it can also communicate with adipocytes, asking them to release for energy. So when you come to the gross anatomy of the spinal cord, see, when you see the spinal cord, what do you see? You can see that the spinal cord is exiting the foramen magnum of the occipital bone right here. So it's starting there, and it's actually shorter than the vertebral column. It's protected in the vertebral column, but it extends only up to L1, L2 region. So the length is about 18 inches. It's as thick as your thumb, so it's about a half an inch wide. It is protected in the vertebral column, and it will exhibit bilateral symmetry. So if you take a cross section of the spinal cord, it will exhibit bilateral symmetry. That means left side is similar to the right side. And you can see in the posterior end, there is a dip. It is called posterior medial sulcus. And anteriorly, there is a fissure called anterior fissure. And so we'll talk about the anatomy, gross anatomy. And then one of the sad things you and I have seen is like when people injure their spinal cord, either an accident or disease. And we've heard of these words. So if the spinal cord snaps up at C4 or C6, it's called tetraplegia. You know, they don't have sensation below that region. T6 and T8 in the lumbar region would be paraplegia, I mean L1. So they don't have sensation in their legs. So that's paralysis. So that's a sad thing that can happen because nerves don't regenerate and multiply like other cells in the body. So some of the gross anatomy. So here you see the brain exiting, it's tapering off to form the spinal cord, and it goes up to L1, L2. So the diameter, see the thickness of the spinal cord is not the same throughout. It has a swelling here. It's called cervical enlargement. So this is where it's like a junction. All the nerves of your shoulders and your upper limbs will join here. So that's why that enlargement, it's called cervical enlargement. The next enlargement is the lumbar enlargement. Again, this is a junction of nerves of your pelvis and lower limbs. It ends in a cone-shaped structure called conus medullaris. Conus medullaris. So this conus medullaris is right below the lumbar enlargement. And then it anchors. So all the dura mater will come together and it will anchor the spinal cord to the coccygeal bone here, your tailbone. So it will taper off to form the phylum terminal, and it anchors the spinal cord in the vertebral column. So this is for support. After L1 and L2, there's a whole bunch of nerves that are exiting the spinal cord. They are called cauda equina. Equina, it looks like a horse's tail. So it's called cauda equina. There are 31 spinal segments, C1, C2, C3. So there's 8 cervical segments, 12 thoracic, and 5 lumbar segments. So here in the cervical, nerves are named after the inferior vertebrae, whereas the other spinal cords here in the lower region, they are named after the superior vertebrae. So here is a live picture of the spinal cord. And some of the things that you can see here is, see the nerve tissue is exiting the spinal cord in small roots. They're called rootlets. There's anterior and posterior rootlets. They will come together to form the spinal nerves. So the ventral root will contain, see the ventral root here, the rootlets are coming together. They join to form a ventral root. They are the motor neurons, whereas the dorsal root is the sensory neurons. In the dorsal root, there's a very interesting bulge. It's called as the dorsal root ganglia. And this is where you find the cell bodies. So these are the unipolar neurons that we studied last week. So the cell bodies are gathered. So they'll be found on either side of the spinal cord. It's called spinal dorsal root ganglia. It's called as a chain ganglia. So the ventral root and the dorsal root, bringing in the sensory or the dorsal or the motor or the ventral, come together to form a mixed nerve. So that is the spinal nerve. They come together to form one nerve. So spinal meninges is very interesting and easy to follow. So in the spinal meninges are the connective tissue that is protecting the spinal cord. So you can see the vertebra here, and in the vertebral foramen, you can see the spinal cord is protected. It is protected by several layers of connective tissue. They are called meninges. So now the meninges, both in the spinal cord and the brain, are the same. So it extends over the spinal cord and then it goes over the brain like a shower cap. So this is going to isolate the spinal cord from the surrounding tissues, because the brain and the spinal cord are very, very precious. They don't regenerate like other tissue. So we have to protect what we have. So another important feature about the meninges is it forms like a conduit for the blood supply, because both brain and spinal cord require a lot of nutrition, energy, and ATP. So the blood supply will bring in all the nutrients and remove all the toxins, just metabolic toxins. And you probably heard the word, if the meninges is infected by either bacteria or virus, it's called as meningitis. So there are three main layers protecting the spinal cord. Dura mater is the outside, very, very tough connective tissue. It is tough, it is fibrous. Cranially, it fuses with the periosteum of the occipital bone. It is continuous with the dura mater of the brain. And it is made up of collagen fibers. And then distally, it will join with the phylum terminal and anchor the spinal cord to the coccygeal bone, coccyx. So you can see the dura mater. It is also called tough mother, tough mother. The next layer is arachnoid matter, and the innermost layer is pia mater. Pia mater means gentle mom. So the space between the dura mater and the vertebra, the vertebral canal, is filled with fat and loose connective tissue. Epidural space. So you remember that word, epidural injection is administered here in the epidural space. So this is the space between the spinal cord and the vertebral column. So the next would be arachnoid matter, which is the next membrane. It is made up of simple squamous epithelium. It is also called spider mom. It looks like a spider web. And underneath, between the dura mater and the arachnoid matter, is the subarachnoid space. Subdural space, sorry. And between the arachnoid matter and the pia mater is the membrane, is the gentle mom or the connective tissue membrane that is sticking to the spinal cord. So the space between them is called subarachnoid space. And in this space, you would find the cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid is freely floating all around the spinal cord and also through the central canal. So the hole right in the center. So it's going to bring in all the nutrients that's needed for the tissue survival, and then it will remove the toxic waste. So when we do a lumbar tap or a spinal tap, they will go in and we can't monitor you can't take a piece of your brain to see what's wrong during a pathology, but they'll take a little bit of spinal tap, which is an indicator or a diagnostic tool of something happening in the brain when you want to do diagnosis. It's called lumbar puncture or spinal tap. On either side of the spinal cord, you can see something called denticate ligaments. So these are ligaments that go east-west. So they will make sure that the spinal cord doesn't wobble inside the vertebral column. So they are for support. It's called denticate ligaments. And they will stabilize side-to-side movement. And the blood vessels are found all along the pia mater. In the subarachnoid space. So this, like if you had done a dissection, we would have seen all of this in the lab. So you can see the rootlets, how they run together to form the nerve. You can see the denticate ligaments. You can see the anterior median fissure here. And you can see the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater is sticking to the spinal cord. So these are the meninges of the spinal cord. So now let's take a cross section of the spinal cord. We can make a cut here and see what's happening. So it's called the histology of the spinal cord. It's very interesting. You'll see a butterfly pattern of dark matter and white matter. So the white matter is found on the periphery, and the butterfly shaped dark matter with like these projections or horns is found right in the center surrounding the central canal. So the gray matter, it's, remember, like we studied last week, the gray color is because of the missile bodies of the endoplasmic reticulum found in the cell body, right? So here they are the neuron cell bodies. They also have neuroglia and unmyelinated neurons. These projections are called gray matter. So we have different projections. So we have posterior horn, a lateral horn, and a ventral horn in the gray matter, and the central canal right in the center. The posterior horn has somatic and visceral sensory nuclei. The anterior horn contains somatic motor nuclei. And the lateral horn, they are mainly found in thoracic and lumbar segments. They have the visceral motor nuclei. Visceral means body organs. The bridge, in the bridge, the axons will actually cross over. It is called gray commissure. The axons will cross from one side of the spinal cord to the other before they reach the gray matter. Gray commissure. The central canal is the hole in the center. It is lined with ependymal cells. Again, if you think of our last week's lecture, ependymal cells are responsible for making the CSF. So that's why it's also called as ependymal canal. So it runs all through the spinal column. So our next objective would be to see how the gray matter and the white matter are organized. So we'll see how the organization is happening. So the gray matter, so if you see the gray matter, you see the somatic nuclei and the, sensory nuclei bringing in sensory information. Either it can be somatic or visceral. And the motor nuclei, again, it can be either visceral or somatic. So here there is a grouping of the gray matter cell bodies to form functional groups. It's called nuclei. The sensory nuclei is dorsal or posterior, and it will connect to peripheral receptors. Remember, it's bringing in information inside the body, inside the CNS through the peripheral receptors. The motor nuclei is ventral or anterior, and they connect to peripheral effectors. How is the white matter organized? They are arranged in bundles or tracks called fasciculi. So they are found in white columns or bundles of axons, and they will take the same information. So the information that's going up to the brain is called as an ascending tract. The information that's going up to the brain is the ascending tract. And then here there'll be interneurons, and they are bringing back the command or the efferent signals it by the descending tract. They carry motor commands to the spinal cord. A little bit more about the gray matter and the white matter. See, this is called spinal cord mapping. The spinal cord and the brain are very highly organized. So it's very easy to predict injuries, the symptoms when an injury happens. So, people can say, if the lateral spinothalamic tract is injured, maybe there is a tumor or a cancer or a trauma, or there was an accident and the patient got severed there, then the outcome would be that the pain and temperature receptors are affected. The dorsal column is responsible for fine touch, proprioception, for perception of vibration, and so forth. See, for example, here, when the anterior horn is, when there's pathologies of the anterior horn, it can lead to polio. So depending on the location of the injury, we can predict the outcome symptoms. I'm very surprised that even vitamin B12 deficiency can affect the nervous system in a very harmful way. Again, an indicator as to how important your diet is on the well-being of your brain and spinal cord. So we'll see how the each nerve is protected. So here in this picture is the spinal nerve. So a bundle of a bundle of axons is called fasciculi, fascicle. So the membrane that surrounds each nerve and protection is called endoneurium. The connective tissue that protects every nerve is endoneurium. Perineurium is protecting a bundle of nerves, or the fascicle. And this is where you see the arteries and veins. And the final covering protecting the entire nerve is called epineurium. So these are the three connective tissue layers. And here you can see how the spinal cord segments form the spinal nerve here. And each spinal nerve is protected by the endoneurium, perineurium, epineurium. Similar words like how we studied in the muscle. This picture is showing dermatomes. So your body has all these, it's like a mapping of the nerve innervation and the skin area it's going to monitor. So dermatomes refer to bilateral regions of the skin that are monitored by one nerve. For example, if you take T1 in the thoracic region, it's going to innervate parts of your shoulder and the anterior part of your arm. So that is the area it's going to monitor. C2, C3 is the posterior back of your head. So these are called dermatomes. So this is the innervation and the area they're going to monitor. Because we know our dermatomes, let's say L5 was pinched. So you'll have like numbness in this area of the skin and tissue. So peripheral neuropathy refers to regional loss or sense, like you don't feel the senses or motor function due to that nerve being pinched or being injured. So like if you have seen a patient with shingles, they have these blisters in this angle across. So you can see how shingles, which is a viral infection that causes that rash, will form like a stripe of blisters that wrap around your hips because it's affecting that nerve. So that's why you see that classic pattern, telltale sign of shingles that's connected to the chickenpox virus. So the next thing is we are studying how they innervate. So spinal nerves and plexuses. The plexus means a whole bunch of, a group of nerves is called as a plexus. And the branching of nerves is called as a rami, R-A-M-I. So a network of nerves is called as a nerve plexus. They are formed by blended fibers, mixed fibers of the ventral rami of the adjacent spinal nerves, and they control skeletal muscles of your neck and the limbs. Ventral rami refers to the branches of the spinal nerves, and they carry sensory and motor fibers for innervation of muscles, joints, and skin of your lateral and ventral body walls and extremities. There are four main plexuses. You have the cervical plexus, brachial plexus. So these are the nerves that exit the cervix of the spinal cord, cervical region. Brachial plexus. Lumbar plexus is the lumbar region, and the sacral plexus is the sacral region. So C1 to C5 are exiting the cervical plexus. So these are all the nerves. So we'll look at like an important nerve for each one of them. So if you study the cervical plexus, they include the ventral rami of spinal nerves C1 to C5. They innervate the neck, the thoracic cavity, and the diaphragm muscles. The most important nerve is the phrenic nerve. It dips down straight and it innervates the diaphragm. Phrenic nerve is for the diaphragm. That is a very important nerve found in the cervical plexus. In the brachial plexus, they include the rami of spinal nerves C5 to T1. They innervate the pectoral girdle, your upper limbs. The nerves will form the brachial plexus that originate from the superior, middle, and inferior trunks. So this is the branching to form these trunks. And these trunks will further branch into cords and nerves. For example, you can see the axillary nerve is C5, C6. And the axillary nerve will innervate the deltoid, the teres minor muscle, and they will collect sensory information from the skin of the shoulder. So we have the radial nerve, a deep radial nerve, the ulnar nerve, named so because it's adjacent to the ulnar bone. There's a medial nerve, musculocutaneous nerve. So this is the innervation of the brachial plexus. Lumbar plexus, as the name indicates, is the lumbar nerves from T12 to L4. So here we see the nerves of the spinal lumbar plexus. We have the femoral, the obturator. For example, the obturator is L2 to L4. It will innervate the adductors of your hip, like your adductor magnus, adductor brevis, adductor longus, also your gracilis muscle, and the skin over the medial surface of your thigh. Sacral plexus are the nerves that innervate, that will exit the sacrum. So here it is, S1, S2, sacrum. So we have the pudental nerve, the sciatic nerve, which is very important, the tibial and the fibular nerve. So these nerves will control your lower limbs. For example, you can take the pudental nerve, S2 to S4. They will innervate muscles of the perineum, including the urogenital diaphragm and the external anus and the urethral sphincter muscles. They also innervate the skin of the external genitalia and related skeletal muscles. So when we studied the four plexus, you can see that each one is every tissue in your body, every cell in your body is monitored by a muscle. So when the nerve neuropathy happens, the tissue will slowly die off. We have to, there are many neurons in the body, right? There's like millions and millions of neurons. So they will form something called neural pools. So what are the functional organization of neurons? There's about 10 million neurons that's collecting sensory data and delivering it to the central nervous system. We have about 500,000 motor neurons that is delivering commands from the brain to the peripheral effectors. But most of the neurons are interneurons. We have about 20 billion of them. And these neurons are functionally organized or grouped to form something called neural pool. This picture is showing how, there's one neuron coming in. So this is the knee-jerk reflex. So here's one neuron that is coming in and it's processed in the spinal cord and it goes out. So when there is a direct communication between a sensory and a motor neuron, it is called monosynaptic reflex. When an interneuron is involved, it is called polysynaptic reflex. This picture is showing the functional organization of neurons or the neural pools, neuronal pools. So these are functional groups of interconnected neurons, which will have a limited input source and an output destination. And it can either stimulate or depress parts of the brain or spinal cord. When you see a picture of divergence, it is the spread of information from one neuron to several neurons. So one neuron is going to accept the stimulus and it's going to pass on to more than one neuron. So it is diverting. It's called divergence. On the contrary, if convergence is referring to input from one neuron that goes to a mechanism of providing information from several neurons to one neuron. It's converging into one neuron. In serial processing, the information is relayed in a stepwise stepwise fashion from one neuron to the other neuron and the other neuron and so forth. It's called serial processing. Parallel processing, as this picture shows. So several neuron pools can process the same information parallelly. So the information is transferred at the same time, parallel processing. Reverbation is a very interesting phenomena where the collateral axons along the circuit will extend back towards the source of an impulse in a positive feedback mechanism. So these are the 5 patterns of neural circuits that can be found in the body. This is a picture of the neural reflex. So this hand is accepting a stimulus, maybe like this hand like is touching something hot. So the stimulus is perceived by the receptor cells here. So arrival of the stimulus and activation of the receptor. So what happens is, as soon as we receive that, a action potential will be triggered, right? So it is activation of the sensory neuron. It will fly, the message is flying up the neuron at like lightning speeds. So that is the activation of the sensory neuron. And it is processed in so this would be a graded potential, and then it is processed in the interneuron, information processing. So there'll be a trigger of neurotransmitters here. And then the processed information goes out as a motor command because of an activation of a motor neuron. Maybe the command is to contract the effector muscle, which is the bicep, so that you're pulling out your hand before it gets burnt. So this is the response of the effector. So these are the 5 steps of a reflex that you can see. So what have you studied so far? You studied that the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, overall organization. And it is the main bridge that connects the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. We studied the anatomy of the spinal cord. So when you look at the spinal cord, we saw how it extends from foramen magnum up to L1, L2. We saw the enlargements. We saw conus medullaris, cauda equina, phylum terminal. So these are all gross anatomy. We also studied the protective layers of the spinal cord, which is the meninges, dura mater, tough mother, arachnoid mater, and pia mater, gentle mother. We studied the histology of the spinal cord, the gray matter and the white matter and how they are organized. We saw how spinal nerves were formed, and then how the 3 layers of the spinal nerves that protect each nerve, the endo, peri, and epineuriums. We studied the classification of all the nerves into 4 plexuses. The nerves that innervate the cervical region is called cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral. And we saw some of the main important ones for each one of them. We saw the functional classification of neurons into neuron pools and the circuit patterns as divergence, convergence, serial, parallel, and reverbation. And we finally concluded with the neural arc. And I hope that helps.